A very good afternoon to all of you. I would like to extend a warm welcome to this JGU International Academy, where we are hosting the G20 presidency's context and how Brazil's taking over of it will have large-scale impact on global governance reforms. At the outset, I want to congratulate my friend and colleague, Professor Mohan Kumar, for leading the Center for G20 Studies at Jindal. In fact, I very vividly remember maybe it was a year ago, 1 year ago, when I had spoken to Mohan about the fact that we should set up a center. And at that time, I remember Mohan was asking whether this is just for this time when India will be assuming its presidency. And I said, no, we need to, this is one regional context which will have large-scale implications for the foreseeable future. And hence, we want to play a significant role in creating knowledge and contributing to research in this field. And Mohan took up that leadership, and today we have come to a stage where we have been actively engaged in a range of intellectually engaging events, conferences, lectures, workshops, seminars, and also a book as well. All of these things are happening under the center. So thank you, Mohan, for your leadership. Let me take this moment to extend a warm welcome to Ambassador Pooja Kapoor, Additional Secretary at the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, for accepting our invitation. She is the G20 South Sherpa, and I'm grateful to her for taking time out of her busy schedule to be here. I also want to extend a warm welcome to Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, Distinguished Fellow at the Foreign Policy Studies Program at Gateway House. Ambassador Bhatia has been a great supporter of our university since our early days. So thank you very much, Ambassador Bhatia, for your presence. I also want to extend a warm welcome to Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri, Distinguished Fellow at the Earth Science and Climate Change at TERI, for his acceptance and to be here. Thank you, Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh, Dr. Ms. Nandita Barua, both of whom have been long-term supporters of our institution. What I thought I'll quickly do is that, one of the things that we don't do enough in our country is to have intellectually engaging conversations beyond the government. So an opportunity that we have today with researchers, scholars, ambassadors, and retired ambassadors, because those individuals end up becoming more candid, and we have one with us and a few more as well, actually, in our campus. So these conversations can make a significant impact on not only shaping the immediate future, but also looking at the past and also how it can impact the future. Issues surrounding global governance is actually at the center of what we are facing in India and the world today. Increasingly, we are entering into an even more complex world. There are numerous theaters of conflict, and that's not ceasing to exist. Within those multiple theaters of conflict, we are also looking at other issues, including climate change, as well as environmental issues that are affecting and impacting the future. So it is in this context that we are looking at the G20 presidency of Brazil, but also to what extent India can play an important leadership role. One of the things that India did, and among many other things in its presidency, was to develop a more globally inclusive approach to bring Africa into the larger G20 context. This actually creates new opportunities for us to engage in these discussions, especially when we are facing these conflicts in the world, and there's no better time than now to talk about these things. We're very fortunate that the OP Jindal Global University has the Jindal School of International Affairs, which offers multiple programs, including 2 undergraduate programs and a few master's program. And our own journey in this has been quite inspiring, because not only the master's degree in diplomacy, law and business took off so well, more recently we launched a unique program in the form of a master's in international relations, strategy and security under the aegis of a globally renowned edtech company called Coursera. And in that program, we have students from literally from 40 to 50 countries in the world. This is a 100% online master's program in international relations. And the thing that I noticed in that program is that we have outstanding students who who themselves are sometimes ambassadors, senior diplomats, working in intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, think tanks, research institutions, even at the White House and other places. And it's led by Ambassador and Professor Dr. Mohan Kumar. And the thing that we have learned through that exercise is that issues relating to international relations and global governance have come to occupy a far greater and a more mainstream role in recent times than ever before. The world and young people around the world in particular are more and more interested to look around and address some of these challenges. Our own experience of having 2 undergraduate programs in this, one on BA in Global Affairs and the other on BA in Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, that also helped us understand the kind of extraordinary interest that is prevailing among a lot of young people in relation to the world at large. So with those words, I want to once again extend a warm welcome to all of you. I sincerely hope you will have meaningful discussions today. I will be jumping in and out of this room, but I look forward to learning more about the outcomes of this event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Now, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Mohan Kumar, a seasoned diplomat with over 36 years of experience in the Indian Foreign Services and India's lead negotiator at GATT and WTO. Currently serving as the Director General for the Jindal Global Center for G20 Studies, Open Jindal Global University, to provide his invaluable welcome remarks, setting the stage for our deliberations.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Raj, for those opening remarks. I think I will reserve my remarks for the global governance issue a little later, because I'm supposed to be the moderator for the next session, and I think it'll be appropriate if I said that. My main job is to welcome very warmly my former colleague and friend, Ambassador Pooja Kapoor. It's completely fortuitous that she's here, because I had no idea that she had arrived, and somebody drew my attention that not only has she arrived, she will be the G20 Sous Sherpa. So I immediately said, what better occasion than this to have her here. So Pooja, thank you so much for making time and for being here. I can assure you, you will now be a constant fixture, subject to your availability, of course. But it's really a great pleasure. We used to work together in the BSM division when she took charge of Myanmar and when I was Joint Secretary, BSM. I just want to say that Brazil has established 3 priorities. And what we have done in the center is to have 3 sessions. So the first session on inclusive economic growth has already taken place, and we've got the recommendations ready. Today's will deal with global governance, which is the second priority of the Brazilian presidency, and we hope to have a set of recommendations. And the third, which will be held August, Varunesh? August after the break, that will be climate change, because that's the third priority for the Brazilian presidency. We hope to have these recommendations ready, which we will then pass on to the Brazilian ambassador here. And subject to what you say, Raj, we also hope to have a delegation participate in the Rio Summit G20 in November, December. So that's really the plan. I thought we could first hear from Ambassador Pooja Kapoor about how India views Brazilian presidency priorities. I don't know if all the students are aware, other people may be aware, that there is a troika. And the troika is the past presidency, the current presidency, and the next one. It's again completely fortuitous that we have a set of developing countries which are assuming the leadership of G20 one after the other. We had Indonesia, then we had India. We are going to have South Africa, so we're going to have Brazil and then South Africa. That is, I don't think, I must check with Mukul, who's associated with G20 earlier. I don't think it has ever happened like that. We've never had a series of 4, and these are not just any developing countries. These are emerging countries, and as some of you know, emerging countries played an important role in the Delhi G20 summit, acting as a bridge between G7 on the one hand and China, Russia on the other. That's how we've been able to get a consensus. And it took some doing from the Prime Minister of India, the Sherpa, and the entire G20 team. So I think this promises to be interesting. We will take in as many questions as possible. We have very illustrious panelists, as the Vice Chancellor said. and we will try and see how we can submit these recommendations to the Brazilian presidency. So with those few words, thank you very much for coming. Pooja, it gives me enormous pleasure in welcoming you, not just to Delhi, but also to the G20 setup. And if you can please deliver your remarks, we will move on to the panel. Thanks.
It is now my privilege to introduce to you all Ambassador Pooja Kapoor. Ambassador Kapoor serves as an additional secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi, and as G20 Sous Sherpa. With extensive diplomatic experience, she has served at Indian embassies in Denmark, Paris, Brussels, London, and Kuala Lumpur. Her roles in the MEA include overseeing India's relationship with Western Europe, Southeast Asia, the UN, and the Commonwealth, including heading the ASEAN Multilateral Division. And now invite Ambassador Kapoor to address the gathering and convey her special remarks.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Professor C. Rajakumar, Professor Ambassador Mohan Kumar, distinguished panelists, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to join you this afternoon for a special session on Brazil's G20 presidency, global governance reforms, being co-hosted by the Jindal Global Center for G20 Studies in collaboration with the Indian Rights Network. This is my first public speaking engagement since joining the Ministry of External Affairs G20 team earlier this month, and before I formally step into the Sous Sherpa's shoes in a week's time. Thus, amongst all the learned academics and professionals in this hallowed hall, I am perhaps the novice. I'm especially honored to be in the midst of several distinguished senior colleagues, Dr. Mohan Kumar, my Joint Secretary BSM, Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, who was ambassador in Myanmar at that time when I was the desk officer, Ambassador Manjeev Puri, who was my ambassador in Brussels when I was the Councillor Minister in charge of the European Union. So a very special good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for organizing this mini reunion for me. If I were to think of the top 10 keywords or phrases in the Indian lexicon in the past year, G20 would certainly figure. The G20, as we all know, started as the premier forum for international economic cooperation, but has evolved to become the foremost agenda-setting body in the world, representing 19 of the world's largest economies, and also 2 regional groupings spanning the developed and developing worlds, accounting for about over 2/3 of the world's population and 85% of global GDP. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi, India hosted the G20 presidency in what was arguably the most successful presidency to date, unmatched in size, scale, and scope. The substantive centerpiece of the G20 summit was the New Delhi G20 leaders delegation, adapted unanimously despite the fractious global geopolitical situation. The declaration reflected uniquely Indian perspectives of universal, equitable, and inclusive solutions to contemporary global challenges, notably endorsing the theme of Vasudev Kutumbakam, or One Earth, One Family, One Future, addressing the Ukraine issue in a consensual manner, championing the voice of the Global South, and walking the talk by inducting the African Union as a permanent member of the G20, as the Vice Chancellor mentioned, committing to the G20 action plan to accelerate progress on the SDGs, endorsing the life concept on planet behavior, calling to scale up development and climate finance from billions to trillions, and agreeing to set up a new collective quantified goal of climate finance this year, agreeing to triple renewable energy capacity globally by 2030, calling for better, bigger, and more effective and representative multilateral development banks, endorsing digital public infrastructure to deliver affordable services at scale, emphasizing responsible artificial intelligence with pro-innovation regulation and governance, endorsing women-led development, adopting global food security principles, endorsing a global initiative on digital health, strongly condemning terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, and endorsing well-managed, regular, skills-based migration pathways. On the sidelines of the summit, too, there were laudable achievements, including the launching of the Global Biofuels Alliance, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, the meeting of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment with the aim to mobilize $600 billion by 2027 for achievement of SDGs, and the India, Brazil, South Africa, US meeting, which saw 4 consecutive G20 presidencies meeting to commit to building bigger, better, and more effective multilateral development banks, together with the World Bank. As Brazil took over the G20 presidency last December, it was evident that it had big shoes to fill. As Ambassador Mohan Kumar said, the Brazilian presidency has identified 3 major priorities: social inclusion and the fight against hunger, energy transition and sustainable development in its social, economic, and environmental aspects, and reform of global governance institutions. Today's conference is timely, for it comes when the Brazilian presidency's calendar is heating up, and because it aptly focuses on the global governance institutional reform agenda, which India championed, and which Brazil will carry the mantle forth for very strongly, and we support them in this endeavor. When I first joined the Indian Foreign Service nearly 28 years ago, the case for reform of global governance institutions was self-evident. Today, it is imperative, for the institutions of the 20th century are no longer fit for purpose in the 21st. The world has witnessed rapid globalization and technological change, along with the emergence of new power centers such as China, India, Brazil, etc. New challenges, from climate change to global health crises, security threats to persisting economic disparities, have put the global governance architecture, already out of date and reflecting the power dynamics of the post-World War II era, under unprecedented strain. The exceptional period of turmoil that the world has witnessed has led to the erosion of trust in the multilateral order. The G20 itself is, of course, testament to a new emerging world order, reflecting the diffusion of economic, military, and diplomatic capabilities and responsibilities across continents. G20 recognizes that to reinstate faith in global governance institutions and multilateral solutions, there needs to be change, and this needs to happen soon. This is significant since the G20 has emerged as a principal platform to give policy direction on almost all important international issues. Over the last 2 decades, the need for multilateral reform has been well recognized by the Millennium Declaration, by the 2005 World Summit, in the 75th anniversary of UN Declaration in 2020, and in the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration, which recognized the urgent need for more inclusive and reinvigorated multilateralism and reform aimed at implementing the 2030 Agenda. From India's perspective, what we need today is a paradigm shift in the structures and working methods of key global institutions to make them more responsive to contemporary challenges. In India's view, such a reform multilateralism would have 4 broad elements. 1, making international financial institutions more representative and effective. And as I mentioned earlier, the New Delhi Leaders Declaration specifically agreed to deliver better, bigger, more effective, and more representative multilateral development banks. 2, improving the working methods of the United Nations subsidiary bodies and international organizations by codifying formal principles and doing away with non-transparent and selective approaches. 3, not allowing the multilateral system to be undermined by senior personnel acting in their own interest rather than that of the organization that they represent. And 4, comprehensive reform of the United Nations. Global crises have demonstrated that lack of due and fair representation at key UN decision-making bodies renders them ineffective. Coming to the specifics, we are nearing 2030 and are lagging far behind both the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate goals. To make progress on both, we require enhanced financial, resources, and large-scale technological support for developing countries. G20 leaders have agreed in New Delhi regarding bigger, better, and more effective MDBs, which will be important in our efforts to mobilize financing from all sources and for securing a quantum jump from billions to trillions of dollars for development, as well as for climate action. A G20 independent expert group on strengthening MDBs was set up by the Indian presidency to provide guidance on how MDBs could be strengthened to meet the needs of development and just transition. Quick implementation of this group's recommendations is needed so that enhanced finance can start flowing in. India is pushing for this within the G20. As regards the UN system, the reference to UNGA Resolution 7511 calling for UN reforms was agreed to for the first time in the G20 during the Indian presidency. It is particularly important that the process of reform of UN Security Council should be open, transparent, and outcome-oriented, to be completed within a defined time frame. In this context, the UN can take inspiration from the induction of the AU in the G20 at New Delhi. For if the G20 could expand successfully, why cannot the UNSC? Expansion would bring the UN Security Council in line with contemporary realities and improve its effectiveness and credibility, as something which Ambassador Puri, I'm sure, will tell you a lot about, given his longer tenure at our mission in the UN. The UN Summit of the Future, which will take place later this year, could potentially bear some promising results. As regards the WTO, the G20 leaders reaffirmed in New Delhi that a rules-based, non-discriminatory, fair, open, inclusive, equitable, sustainable, and transparent multilateral trading system with the WTO at its core is indispensable. They reiterated the need to pursue WTO reform to improve all its functions through an inclusive, member-driven process, and committed to discussions with a view to having a well-functioning dispute settlement system accessible to all members by 2024. However, the WTO Ministerial Conference last month did not yield results as expected. Nevertheless, the G20 continues pushing for reforms, especially in the dispute settlement mechanism, and we have an in-house expert on all matters WTO, and I'm sure Ambassador Kumar will delve deeper into these. To sum up, as we all know, the reform of global governance is not about bureaucratic reshuffling or diplomatic maneuvering. It's rather strategic, imperative, and of course a moral imperative. The current configuration in the G20 sees 4 developing countries at the helm on a trot: Indonesia and India, as Ambassador Kumar said, followed by Brazil and South Africa, as the first cycle of G20 presidencies concludes. So this is the first time that these countries have actually held the presidency, so it's unprecedented. This is a unique opportunity to reorient the G20 towards a more development-focused agenda, towards issues which are of pressing importance to the global south, and towards reforming global governance, all of which India so effectively articulated and championed during its presidency, and which Brazil will carry forth. I'm confident that today's deliberations will throw fresh ideas to help chart a progressive course towards a more inclusive and effective system of global governance that truly serves the common good. I would request O.P. Jindal's G20 Center to also share all the recommendations with us, because we will help channel them into the system from our side. And I know, Ambassador, you said I should talk about all 3 priorities of the Brazilian presidency, but that would mean you would not invite me again. So I've only focused on global governance today. And to all the young people in the audience, it's a great pleasure to see you all, and I look forward to staying connected with you and the university. Thank you.
It is now time we begin with the first panel discussion for the day on Brazil's G20 presidency global governance reform. The panel will be expertly moderated by Professor Dr. Mohan Kumar, guiding our distinguished panelists through a nuanced exploration of challenges and opportunities ahead. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our panelists for the session. First of all, we have with us Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, a distinguished fellow of the Foreign Policy Studies program at Gateway House. He has held various significant positions in organizations like CII, FICCI, and the Kalinga International Foundation. With expertise in international relations and diplomacy, he has contributed significantly to the areas of trade, multilateralism, and regional cooperation. Joining the panel, we also have with us Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri, Distinguished Fellow, Earth and Science and Climate Change at TERI. He is a former Indian diplomat who has served as Ambassador of India to European Union, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Nepal. He has extensive experience in multilateral diplomacy, particularly in the UN, and has contributed extensively to issues related to climate change, sustainable development, and international cooperation. We also have with us joining online Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh, Director of the Observer Research Foundation India, where he heads the Center for New Economic Diplomacy and ORS Kolkata Center, and is the President of Indian Society for Ecological Economics. Finally, we have with us Ms. Nandita Barua, the Asia Foundation's country representative in India, with over 25 years of experience in gender, human rights, labor migration, and human rights trafficking issues in South and Southeast Asia. She has held leadership positions in various regional programs and organizations working towards a sustainable world.
On global governance, I will begin with Ambassador Bhatia, but I think we will have others chip in. The question I have for you is, has Brazil got a certain specific objective in mind? And would it be fair to assume that the objective is the same as the G4, which is, you've got India, Brazil, Japan, and Germany. So the G4, so that is at one level. So the first thing is UN Security Council reform. Is that I have given up, frankly, on the UN Security Council reform. The question now is whether G20 can push things in a particular direction. And I dare say that if India, Brazil, South Africa cannot do it, then I think it's an opportunity lost. We might as well say goodbye to it, frankly, on the UN Security Council reform. On the others, I think the G20 has made progress. I particularly draw your attention to the Lawrence Summers encasing report. 2 reports have emerged, and this is on multilateral development banks. Those are important. In many ways, they are probably more important than the UN Security Council reform, because people need money for things like climate change, achievement of SDG goals, and so on. So the second is, can those reports be brought to fruition, or will they just remain reports? The first report came out when India's presidency was just beginning, and then we have a second report now. I don't know if it has come out yet, but it should have. So what do we do with these 2 reports? And can India, try to join hands with Brazil, the Troika, and try and see whether those things can happen? I think the last thing that I want to say or ask is also that what do we do with so many minilaterals and plurilaterals? They do form part of the international architecture, and many of those in the Indo-Pacific, and I'm fond of using the word lattice work. The lattice work of strategic architecture that has emerged in the Indo-Pacific. Should G20 have a view on that? That's question number 1. Question number 2. Even in the G20, you have at least 3 camps, if not more. You have the G7, and then you have China, Russia, and then of course you have what External Affairs Minister Jaishankar calls the non-West. India, Brazil, South Africa, and so on. Japan you can't include in non-West. Japan is admittedly Western. So I think this is what I would like to know. The Vice Chancellor said the center will be in permanence. I'm always happy to have a permanent job because I'm used to it in the government of India, so that's fine. But jokes aside, really, the question is, the G20 Center in Toronto evaluates the commitment every year. That I found very interesting. They were here about 6-8 months ago. Pooja, I wish you were here, but we will try and make that available to you. Varunesh, I think a lot of documents must be made available to Ambassador Pooja Kapoor's office, please. She should have some background of what we have done just before she came. And it was very interesting that they came up with a figure of 60 to 70% in terms of G20 summits and declarations which have been fulfilled. They have their own criteria, of course. But I would be very keen to know if Brazil has come up and identified the objective, which is reforming global governance, then obviously it'll be evaluated. I would like to evaluate it, frankly, from my center and see whether any progress takes place. in global governance. So really, this is what I wanted to say. If I can invite the illustrious panelists to come, I didn't want each one to come to the kind of podium and then speak. This is much better.
Dear friends, I can see that it's a very blended audience, but I think the common bond is that all of us are very knowledgeable about G20, and so it's a little bit overwhelming to try to update this story and try to come up with something really new or something worthwhile. And I'm very happy that our panelists are here and Government of India is here. So it's a good time and good chance to put across perhaps some substantive points. And yes, 10 minutes, I would respect Mohan. You have also raised some really thoughtful and thought-provoking questions, so I'll try to weave them into my very brief presentation. It was just about a month back, a similar event took place here, 18th of March, if I'm not mistaken. And I realized that Jindal is very serious about its role as the G20 center, and they are going about it in a very positive and very systematic fashion. And this really encouraged me because for the last about 15 months, that is 3 or 4 months before India's presidency began, and then throughout the 12-month period, we were over feasting on information about G20 this country. And then suddenly, as soon as the presidency went to Brazil, we went on a fast. You won't see a single article in any major Indian daily about G20 now. This is not, I think, a very healthy trend. I think so clearly this room is filled with those who are convinced that G20 is important no matter where the presidency resides. And it is important for all the countries whether or not they are the president. And therefore, I think this dedication that Jindal has shown, and particularly Mohan has shown, is something that deserves to be appreciated and supported. This particular meeting is timed with the second meeting of the G20 finance ministers. 17th and 18th, they are meeting in Washington on the sidelines of the spring meeting of finance ministers and central governors. So we have to be a bit in the dark today. I think we need a day or two before we would get to know as to what the outcome was there. The first meeting took place in February, and we had discussed this at the Jindal event just a month back. And so we will have to look at what exactly finance ministers and central bank governors are doing on this whole question of global governance relating to them, which is just one issue, the reform and strengthening of the multilateral development banks, or MDBs. Now here, I'd expressed last time my sense of unease that a lot of us sitting here in India thought that Mr. Summers and Mr. N.K. Singh had done a fantastic job. The first report was out. They also had presented a preview of the second report as well. And it seemed that actually a broad consensus had developed at the level of the leaders that MDBs have to be strengthened, broadened, and some specific points were agreed. For example, it was agreed that MDBs must have more resources. The second point that was agreed was that then MDBs would be in a position to offer more funds to the developing countries for a variety of purposes, for dealing with climate crisis, for development, and handling their financial flows and the balance of payments, etc. And on top of that, the third point they had agreed was that there would be a greater representation of the developing world in the leadership decision-making echelon of the MDBs. And finally, there was this idea that a complete roadmap to strengthen MDBs would be worked out. So when we ended the Delhi summit and the Indian presidency, many of us were sitting quite pretty and happy, saying that now, at last, G20 has got a way out, and now they simply have to formalize the decisions and then begin focusing on implementing it. And lo and behold, the moment the presidency goes to Brazil, as far as I could see from this distance, they again started discussing the same issues that we were discussing for the previous 12 months in India. Now, this was a little bit of a shock, and slowly, obviously, realism came through that, Manjeev Puri's tribe, the genuine multilateralists, they know how to cycle and recycle the same arguments in a big manner. And I'm saying it in a positive manner. I'm not saying in a negative manner. So I've been following what is going on in Brazil. And some of the scholars who were here are now, they've gone back to Brazil. I keep in touch with them. And that's why I have to be tentative. One will have to see what really is projected at the end of the Washington meeting, of the second meeting of finance ministers, to know whether they are abiding by the decisions, and then now they're going to work on the implementation. So this is my first basic issue on the MDBs. I'm afraid I cannot share more because frankly, not much information is available in the public domain as yet. In the presence of Ambassador Mohan Kumar, it's very risky to talk about WTO. So I respect his expertise. All that we know is nothing much is happening there. And therefore, if one were to simply dismiss it in 3 or 4 sentences, probably one would not be off the mark. Again, it's very risky to talk about UN Security Council in the presence of Ambassador Puri. He has devoted a lifetime following this. But what I can say is, and I'm going to be very candid, in Delhi, we produced a very substantive 2 or 3 paragraphs on rejuvenated multilateralism. And this was really going outside the jurisdiction of G20, but they were meeting at the level of the leaders, so they were perfectly within their rights to talk about and decide anything under the sun. That is what the leaders do. It was not just a finance ministers meeting. It was the presidents and prime ministers. But as a scholar, I feel that this whole ambition to reform the UN Security Council in particular, at this time, when the international system is so deeply and extensively fractured, it is taking leave of realism. I think we have to be totally realistic and admit that there are very serious problems. This becoming a decade of what I call a series of crises and conflicts, starting from 2019 or 2020, COVID, India-China clash, Ukraine, Gaza, Houthis, Iran and Israel, and God knows what else. So in this kind of situation where major powers are divided, as a result, the Security Council simply cannot work. If they can't even get a ceasefire to help, the poor innocent Palestinians who are getting killed every day, do you really think that they can reform overnight the Security Council? That is the question that we need to ask. So if we are talking about making recommendations, Mohan, first we will have to develop a kind of a consensus whether progress is feasible in the foreseeable future. We are talking a great deal about the summit of the future. Now that future is here, April 2024. I think the summit is in October, November, or December, somewhere there. The future is here. So for the last 3 or 4 years, we were building up the hopes that when the future of the summit of the future comes, something might happen. But now we have to be realistic. So all that I can say is that some of us are somewhat skeptical, but it is quite possible that those who know about the UN from inside, they may have a different view. I would like to end this by making a couple of suggestions for Brazil and for the Sioux Sherpa. I'm sure some officers from Brazil are here, Brazilian embassy. As you noticed, India's strategic community is very deeply and seriously interested in G20. But it is really starved of information. And therefore, I would suggest that there can be collaboration between our secretariat, G20 secretariat, and Brazil embassy to at least hold a monthly or maybe once in 2 months briefing for the media as to what is going on in G20. This will help Brazil itself, and it will help the cause of the developing world, because then this will motivate our young G20 scholars to study it more thoroughly and probably write about it. And my second suggestion again, but particularly to the headquarters in Brazil, is that T20 channel needs to be strengthened a little bit more. And again, once in a quarter or once in 2 months, they can do a digital interaction with the think tanks which are on their network in all G20 countries. Nobody has to fly around in these days anymore, but a digital conference to simply tell G20 scholars as to what is happening and how far we have reached in various issues, that would be also very, very helpful. So I would like to basically conclude by saying that we are at that point in journey where we know that Brazil is very strongly determined to turn its presidency into a successful presidency, but there is still a little bit of lack of information, at least in this part of Asia, and that needs to be remedied through the kind of collaboration which I have spelled out. Thank you very much.
Presentation by the director from ORF.
Yes.
But before that, Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, when I come back to you and others, what prevents the G20 in Brazil from saying that the leaders agreed to a comprehensive reform of the UN Security Council within 2 years? Question for Manjeev as well. Okay, in all probability, it will not be done. But that I see as a way of putting pressure. Otherwise, all the statements are open-ended. So is it beyond the realm of realism, as you say, to say that 2 years from now? After all, every leader says it's vital, it's imperative that we should be reforming the UN Security Council. What's the worst that can happen? It will not get done. That's okay, we are in that situation anyway for the last 20 years. So I think that's one thing that I'd like to pick your brains on, all of you. Varunesh, if you can have the director of ORF, please. Thank you. Thank you, sir. That was, I thought, a comprehensive presentation. Thank you very much.
I would like to request Mr. Nilanjan Ghosh to please start his address. We are looking forward to that.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Thank you. At the very outset, let me thank Ambassador Mohan Kumar for inviting me. Unfortunately, I couldn't be present physically, but thanks for this opportunity of connecting virtually. Well, how do I essentially qualify to talk about Brazilian G20 or the G20 in general? I played a minuscule role, in fact, in the Indian G20 and even a smaller role in the Brazilian G20. In fact, Ambassador Bhatia just mentioned about the T20 or the Think 20. I was the director of the Think 20 India Secretariat, which was housed at the Observer Research Foundation. And right now, in fact, I'm also the co-chair of the Think 20 engagement group, co-chair of the Task Force 3 of Think 20 Brazil Presidency, which is the Task Force 3 above is about international financial architecture. And precisely, we are tasked with looking at SDG financing. Now, the fact remains that when India assumed the G20 presidency, it was in the midst of a global flux. The post-pandemic recovery efforts were uncertain and uneven. There was supply chain crisis, supply chain bottlenecks, consequent global stagflation, perennial onslaught of elephant in the room of global warming and climate change only aggravated the challenges at that point in time. Now, ever since Indonesia's presidency in 2022, I would say the voice of the global south emerged in the context of the G20 through what in the G20 process we call the double troika presidencies, rather than calling them a quadrilateral. Indonesia, India, Brazil, and then India, Brazil, South Africa. So this double troika is slated to amplify the voice of the global south in the entire G20 process. Now, the need for a reformed and inclusive global governance structures that have been collectively recognized as the imperative to confront the 21st century challenges with renewed vigor and increased cooperation in the G20 platform is now being acknowledged. This has been further cemented with the New Delhi Declaration carried out by the Indian G20 presidency, which talked about an integrated approach given the interconnectedness of the challenges and revitalized multilateralism. Now, in this context, Brazil's presidency of the G20 presents a pivotal opportunity, especially to advance the reform of the global governance system. Now, they are, of course, going to build upon the substantial progress that was made during the G20 Indian presidency. And this presidency carries significant expectations in fostering financial and economic governance that effectively tackles the multifaceted crisis facing the world today. So, the first and foremost thing that it encounters is strengthening multilateralism for equitable finance. Well, I'm not going to get into the other domains at this point in time. In fact, talking about the Security Council or suppose say the security domain as though there is an inextricable linkage when we talk about the global developmental governance. Now, when I use the term global developmental governance or institutions or parameters which act as limbs of the global development governance, essentially I'm going to talk about the SDGs. One very significant element is the Global South, and one of the major achievements of the Indian presidency, which in fact Vice Chancellor quite rightly put out, was the inclusion of the African landmass in the G20 bloc, making it the G21. But what I'll do is I'll place 5 imperatives at this point in time from the perspective of the international financial architecture. The first is reforming the IFA, the international financial architecture. The imperative for reforming the international financial architecture arises from the current system's inadequacy in addressing the scale and depth of the challenges confronting particularly the global south. Now, what is also happening is that a reformed international development financial system is essential for achieving the SDGs. MDBs play a very important role here, but frankly speaking, to a large extent, we have a huge gap when it comes to SDG financing. The gap, the annual gap at this point in time, in fact, till 2030, is being slated to be to the tune of 4.5 trillion US dollar. Now, Brazil's G20 presidency, in fact, there is some kind of an aim to advance the work initiated during the Indian G20 presidency, particularly in strengthening the MDBs. Now, this includes implementing, of course, the roadmap outlined in the NK Singh Samar's report, the 2-volume report, which calls for tripling the MDB financing to 390 billion US dollar annually by 2030, and optimizing the balance sheets through capital adequacy framework. Now, Brazil is already advocating this for innovative approaches and ensure that the IMF follows through on commitments for quota realignment by June 2025. So all you need to do is to enhance the representation and voice of the developing world in the decision-making process. And the G20 has been proactive in urging the revision and implementation of the CAA for the capital adequacy frameworks with a focus on the multilateral development bank's responsiveness to the developing countries' needs. The presidency also needs to work towards fostering the collaboration among the MDBs in areas such as hybrid capital, callable capital, and guarantees to maximize their impact. This is extremely important. So you need enhanced dialogue between the multilateral development banks, the credit rating agencies, shareholders, and this is going to promote transparency in information exchange and rating methodologies. So leveraging the estimated additional lending headroom of approximately US dollar of 200 billion outlined in the G20 CAF roadmap will further drive the implementation of the CAF. Then comes the strengthening of the IMF, which is essential to support the countries facing financial crisis. This involves reviewing funding and governance structures to ensure adequate resources for assistance. So all they need to do is prioritize initiatives like resilience and sustainability trust and poverty reduction and growth trust, along with support for Africa through the G20 compact with Africa. So exploring the SDRs, or what we have the special drawing rights for financial assistance to MDBs, while preserving their reserve asset status will only enhance the IMF's capacity to address the global challenges, especially for the African economies. Now, let me now bring here one very crucial challenge, in fact, which we, in fact, in the global south, large parts of the global south have been facing, and this needs to be brought up. This has been brought up, but needs to be amplified further in terms of a voice from the global south. The concern is with essentially climate financing. And if you look at the climate financing portfolio of most of the multilateral development banks and most of the DFIs, there is a lopsided financing portfolio, except for the Green Climate Fund, GCF. That's the only climate funding agency which maintains some kind of a parity between adaptation and mitigation financing. But for all, whether I talk about the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank or whosoever, 90 to 95% of the funding is getting into mitigation, while adaptation financing receives a stepmotherly treatment. This is also because of the fact that the multilateral development banks are mostly looking at ROI, the return on investment. They are looking at short-term economic rate of return associated with the mitigation projects, overlooking the long-term social rates of return associated with the adaptation projects. This is also because the adaptation projects essentially lead to the creation of public goods. And you don't see an immediate rate of return, an economic rate of return associated with the creation of these public goods. Now, the challenge is how do we bridge this gap? That's large parts of the global south needs adaptation financing. This is something extremely crucial. Then, of course, we have the problem with the global debt crisis because there are large parts of the developing countries which are grappling with a mounting debt burden aggravated by the rising borrowing costs in the financial market. The financial strain severely limits their ability to fulfill fundamental rights and invest in critical infrastructure. Then, the other thing which has, I would say, most aptly taken up by the Brazilian G20 presidency is reforming the international taxation framework. The Brazilian G20 presidency aims to elevate ongoing discussions concerning a more equitable and progressing international taxation system. And this entails considering the various contributions beyond the scope of what we call the base erosion and profit shifting negotiations, or BEPS, at the OECD. And it is going to play a pivotal role. We presume that it holds the responsibility for ensuring the swift and effective implementation of the two-pillar international tax package. This includes finalizing the critical components such as the multilateral convention, and by doing so, the G20 can provide essential support and technical assistance to developing nations, enabling them to actively participate in the global tax framework. The other important thing that it needs to advocate for is expeditious implementation of the crypto asset reporting framework and amendments to the Common Reporting Standard, or the CRS. I'm not going to get into the WTO at this point in time, but what is important out here is that there has to be some kind of, I would say, it has to address the challenges encountered by the micro, small, and medium enterprises, particularly those in the developing nations or in the global south. By focusing on the specific needs and constraints faced by the MSMEs, that it can better support their integration into the global economy and the global value chains. Now, the other important thing is the reformation efforts within the WTO, which has to prioritize aligning trade policies and trade priorities with the environmental objectives. By harmonizing trade and environmental policies, the WTO can promote environmentally friendly practices while facilitating global trade in a manner that is mutually beneficial and environmentally sustainable. But on the other hand, we also have to be careful about some of the other norms which are being set by the global north and which are going to go against the very principle of just transition, just as the European Union CBAM. Simply because this is not going to increase the entire cost of transaction for the global south, especially the smaller nations, and they will be rendered uncompetitive in the entire trade game. My fifth proposition is that last year there was a Think 20 India policy brief that talked about the development of a G20 level development financial institution, like the BRICS Bank. Now, this G20 level DFI can essentially bring about some of the more innovative products which can induce the private sector to put in their money in the entire SDG game. The last few decades reveal that the developing economies and LDCs usually have to bear the brunt of global economic shocks. And in many cases, this also deters the achievements of SDGs. So in that case, it becomes extremely important that an institution which is going to be based on the principles of reconciling between the irreconcilable trinity of global development challenge, governance challenge, I would say, that is between equity, efficiency, and sustainability, has to be brought into the system, and that is how, in fact, the SDG goals can also be made. So, to facilitate collaboration and help economies develop financial frameworks, it becomes an imperative. The experiences of the last 2 decades reveal that there's a need to safeguard the SDGs in the face of various global shocks. So this DFI can be instrumental in reinforcing the North-South partnerships. Global North expertise is instrumental in helping the design of the Global South financing mechanisms. The single organizing body will ensure that geopolitical conditions do not blind the process of forwarding aid to the less developed nations. So, the consequent succession of the G20 presidency transitioning from India, from Indonesia to India, and now to Brazil marks a pivotal moment for global affairs. And with Brazil assuming the G20 presidency, there is optimism for continued progress towards building a faster and a more sustainable and resilient global development governance system that is going to be beneficial for all the nations, regardless of their economic status or geographical location. Let me just end my first round of presentation here. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to thank Dr. Ghosh for the comprehensive presentation. Ms. Nandita Barua, yeah, I think you can decide whether you want to.
I'll try to keep it even shorter because prior to me, a lot of seasoned experts have spoken. First, thank you, Mohan, for inviting me here. And it's wonderful to see a mix of international experts, heads of and representatives from embassy and students and young scholars and think tanks. So pleased to be here. I'm just going to dwell back on the last year of the year when India was holding the G20 presidency and the build up to that. And Mohan, if you recall, we started that journey there with your center and the foundation where we worked to really look at what are the priorities, what opportunities, and a lot of what's being said today has actually been built into the final documents that came out of the G20. Now, I think when we are talking about the global, governance infrastructure, couple of things. I think it's interesting that I think Ambassador Nilanjan before me, also Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia talked about the fact that it's at one level we are looking at a very fractious world, but at another level I think there has never been a bigger moment where I think the world has, at least during the G20 presidency, recognized that while we may have difference of opinion on various things, the solutions that are needed cannot be just driven by a certain perspective in the world. Now, most of the multilateral organizations have come into existence when the reality of the global south was very different from what it is today. And in the global south today, when we are looking at, and as Nilanjan pointed out, we're looking at multiple levels of countries. We are looking at developing countries, countries which have moved from LDC to a developed nation status, or middle income countries. We're also looking at fairly economically advanced countries who may not be advanced in certain aspects of, say, equity and rights, but are financially would probably be as equally advanced as the global norm. However, I think the solutions that we are seeking today, which started with India's G20 presidency, was trying to put, and the attempt is to trying to put the perspectives from this new and emerging global south into the institutions that are defining solutions. And the multilateral institutions became very critical in that conversation. If you recall, just here at this hall, I think last year we had Professor Hebatullah speak on the African Union and the role of MDBs in the way the credits and the financial loaning, etc., was done to the large part of the African Union nations, and the downside of the taxation regime that Nilanjan talked about, the downside of the way interest payments were planned. And we saw the fallout of that most of them then moved to seek financing from the elephant in the room we are not talking about, China. So unless we today link the need for institutional development in the financial institutions, we are going to continue to face this, the polarization between international development and China, in development institutions and China, global south and China. I think the recognition that many of the financial institutions were unable to live up to the needs and the deficiencies in systems in the developing countries meant that it provided an opportunity for a country like China to walk in and provide resources. The downside of the resource is also today visible. However, the process of lending, the way it was done, and other aspects that led to identification of how much money seemed to the countries who took that bait to be lucrative. Question is, of course, whether it is or not remains debated, and we could say that yes, there is a flip side to how that played out in an absolute economic collapse in many countries. So I think for us, again, the question is, within the powers of these multilateral development institutions and the banks, some of these powers have still a strong voice. And unless there is also a discussion at how that can be negotiated and navigated, it's going to be very hard to make those changes. I believe that we created the narrative in India on how to handle those conversations. We created the narrative of what the Global South's interests are, what the Global South's priorities are. And I think that moving that conversation forward in Brazil is going to be critical, and it can't just be left to Brazil. I think, I still feel that India would need to continue to play a critical role in engaging with Brazil, the think tanks, and the G20 globally, because a lot of those happened in Indonesia, and it continued in India, and now I think needs to be pushed forward while we are looking at how Brazil is looking at. And to put a point here, I think when we look at environment and climate, Brazil is at the center of the world's largest climatic zones, where I think protecting the Amazon has become a big issue. Now, the national debate there is still divided and polarized. However, I think this is also an opportunity to look at how some national priorities in countries which are critical to solutions can be elevated to provide a larger push from global communities who see those as being critical environmental challenges, not just from the perspective of that country, but from the world at large. And I think the environmental climate resource, the part where Nilanjan talked about really not just mitigating, but also defining solutions that are affirmative and can move forward, are going to be crucial to moving this process. The other thing which I think we probably have talked about, but need to focus much more, is on knowledge sharing. We've talked about the fact that a lot of these discourses that are happening and that have continued to be fed into the G20 processes need to be really, I feel, shared at a much wider level. When the African Union colleagues were sitting here, few months back, when G20 took in the African Union, we heard from them that the concerns of Africa itself are not linear. They are diverse and yet divided in many things. However, I think getting that process of knowledge sharing, where we can come to some common consensus on issues like climate, on issues like equity, sustainable development, gender, is going to be a critical role that G20 as a collective and countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, and South Africa would need to push forward for as we move forward in this discussion. The other thing also, I know you said that, it's just that it's quite surprising that we have 3 countries plus 1 who are all from the global south. Maybe the stars are aligned. I am an optimist, so I'd say probably the stars are aligned, and this is the time when those voices which have seen a continuum from Indonesia, India, Brazil, hopefully South Africa and others, can become the center stage of what is the architectural change we are demanding. Because right now when we talk, we are talking 2 systems which are being defined by certain power structures which were created more than 30, 40 years back and continue to believe that they still should and would hold power of these institutions and define it from their narrative. I think the idea that these narratives have now been, I don't want to use the word challenge, but now being provided with alternatives from the global south is something that has to be more forcefully engaged with as we move forward. And I think, Indo-Pacific, and you talked about the Indo-Pacific, that's an interesting construct that has come up in the recent past. And it's more and more important that for the global north, I think, the countries like India or Brazil are critical to having a much more decisive engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and we should not forget that when we say Indo-Pacific, we also have to take into consideration countries like Japan and Korea, who can be very instrumental in really adding strength to the voice of the Indo-Pacific in the change that the region is collectively seeking. A lot of that has got to do with maritime security, a lot of that has got to do with environment, a lot of that has got to do with climate and oceans and access and connectivity. I think ensuring that while we talk about these narratives, countries which do have a stronger say or voice in some of these global governance institutions become a stronger part of that voice. How do we ensure that that continuum is built upon, and engagement, as Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia said, with think tanks beyond just what we are engaging with, but also looking at these countries and their presence becomes critical. And finally, I just want to say that my thing on, and I'm not an expert on the Security Council or WTO, I think Ambassador Manjeet, who is sitting here next to me, is definitely much more well placed to say that. I think it's also going to be important when we say we want, and Mohan, you said that why can't we all collectively say we want a change in the Security Council? I think we have been saying it collectively. We want a change. But I think before we say we want a change and this is the change we want, we need to unpack why those who are controlling it don't want that change. And when we unpack why those who are controlling it don't want that change is when we can put forward a much stronger narrative with other partners from a similar troika who would want that change. Right now, whether it's control over water resources or oil resources or nuclear resources, there is a reason for not wanting change. Because the countries at the helm have certain interest in wanting to keep it the way it is. And I'm being candid, and please don't take this as my opinion from the foundation. This is my individual opinion. I would probably lose my job tomorrow if that happened, which would be bad, I know. But I think this is important for us to keep in perspective that those countries' reason for wanting to keep it have to be first called out, not just challenged, but called out, and then put forward the perspective on why we change it. But I am not a diplomat, so maybe that's not the best way. Ambassador Manjeet Puri is one, and he would probably be best placed to say it. So I'm going to stop here and end my...
Perfect. Thank you. Perfect segue. Manjeet, my only problem is I'm under directions to finish at 4:30, so kindly make your remarks as brief as possible. I know you're fully capable of doing that in punchy lines. And maybe you can take off from where Nandita left. So here.
Mohan, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I can see the clock right in front of me. So guys, I've spent a great deal of my professional life dealing with the United Nations. We can try and answer some of these UNSC businesses for you. But I want to tell you, I was perhaps the only single individual in the Larry Summers N.K. Singh's report as somebody whose idea was incorporated in the report, by the way. A little different, okay? And I'll plug that straight away. A lot has been said here about MDBs, etc. This is what you call incrementalism. I dealt with the UN for many years, but I was never an employee there. And so it wasn't my bread and butter issues to continue to prolong the thing. As a permanent employee, I was a Government of India employee. My interest was always in reform. What are the key issues at the MDBs? The reform is the governance reform. It's the key issue, and you keep pushing it down. Last time there was a quota reform of the IMF, nobody said no. You want to know the reason? Let me give you a simple reason. You need 85% voting, yes, for anything to happen at the IMF and the World Bank. The US by itself has between 16.5 and 17 or 18%. End of matter. I hope you know why they are located in Washington DC. If you don't, please just go and look up some basics. Second little point. Why do you think Mr. Trump was always against the WTO and not against the Security Council or against the World Bank? Because it was the one organization set up in the wake of that lovely sweet spot in international relations when the Soviet Union had collapsed. The US was in the magnanimous mode, and so it was each country to one vote. He didn't like it. We don't know what will happen in November in the United States. So be a little cognizant of what happens in the G20 and the UNFCCC, etc., etc. We need to understand this. And Katie, we have from Delphi University here, who's studying India and multilateralism, and perhaps may be able to educate some of us on all of this. Let's look at something else. MDBs and all that you hear from the President, Ajay Banga, the report of Larry Summers, etc. What is it? It's about incrementalism. Increase capital adequacy, we'll get 300 billion more. 300 billion against $6 trillion requirement. Yes, that's the nature of these games. And the answer is, hey guys, you got to do it yourself. And in India also there are people who are trying to tell us, do it by yourself. That's the way it should be done. Oh, we know the story. We've been through this story very well. What can be done, and I have a simple plug for that. What we should do is try and see if we can use the multilateral development institutions to somehow or the other facilitate private flows in the Western world to the largest developing countries. It doesn't matter if it's for mitigation or adaptation. It will come for mitigation because those are project-oriented things. They won't go for adaptation. But if you get it for mitigation, you'll have spare cash available to invest in adaptation. And what was our idea? And it's not just my idea. I'm an economist by training, but it's the idea of practitioners. The single biggest thing that large projects in the developing world, including in the large developing countries like India, face are what are called foreign exchange risks. In practitioners' terms, they are called hedging costs. You know what the hedging costs are? The borrowing rate in the Western world versus what you end up as the paying rate, it's so substantially high that it knocks any project aside. The Western world has enough savings for being able to help. So first fundamental point, try and see that the MDBs find ways of segueing private wealth, private investable capital in the Western world. Here, a key aspect of that are foreign exchange costs. Security Council reform. Mohan, you're very right. You know, everybody will say, let's have the reform. But then we come to Nandita's point. Very important. So what does the reform consist of? You know, many people would say the G20 is an ideal reform for the Security Council. Why? Because you have the big proponents, India, Brazil, Japan and Germany and also South Africa, etc. in it on one side, and you have the so-called naysayers in our world, the Uniting for Consensus, Coffee Club, Indonesia, Turkey, and the whole lot of them. They're also there. If you get together, you get a reform. The problem with the G20 is, and this happens in all large bodies, is that they go from being a political get-together of the most important economic communities, as was the case in 2008, 2009, when it was set up and when action was taken in terms of the global recession at that time. Immediate major action, political thrust was done, SDRs were raised and matters were sorted out and we got over. Now it's become a case of a rolling United Nations. The 200-page documents are coming out. You know what that means? Have you seen the General Assembly resolution? They do have value, but that's about it. And that's what the G20 is getting reduced to. Is it really the political get-together of the economically most hefty people? They matter. Economics matter. Or is it the getting together economically of the politically most hefty guys? I am not so sure about it. Believe me. Third point I want to make is Brazil. You know, they're the granddaddies of multilateralism. Mohan, you come from WTO. All the good ideas came from the Latinos. Sir, it wasn't us guys, except that Mohan Kumar saw to it that the Doha development agenda was done the last time that we were rule makers. So kudos to you, Mohan. The Latinos, and in particular the Brazilians, the Argentinians, the Chileans, they have been trained in this matter for 100 years. It isn't for nothing that that little story of Brazil being the first speaker at the UN comes about. They know what to do. And therefore, the two things that they've chosen, inclusive global order, no one's going to say no to that, are climate change, where let me tell you, we may not be on the same page as they are. There are lots of issues to it. It isn't a very simple matter. But again, what would I choose where they would be on the same page as us? And that is financing. What can we do in terms of financing? And let's look at the various things. Brazil, G20, Brazil will host the COP next year. Azerbaijan will host the COP this year, and so on. Of course, the big elephant in the room is the US elections. I don't know what to say about all of it. Because that can be a game changer for 4 years. That's the nature of the power that that country holds in all of this. So we need to try and be strategic on that. I think we did very, very well in terms of our G20, domestically, internationally, etc. But let's also understand this configuration that you are coming through. India, Brazil, South Africa, this is the old IPSA. Remember, this is a 20-year-old thing, in a sense, but is it the same? No, it's not. The configuration is vastly different, and many of these things are quite different from the way they go on. And Brazil and India will be on the same page on global governance reforms. But, you know, I was talking to you about the IMF, etc. I just mentioned the US with 16%. You know who's the second largest quota holder, power holder? Is Japan at 6.14%. Do you think the Japanese should be number 2 in today's world? Which of you is going to say that? The answer is no. But do you want that other country to become the second one? That's the game. And that's what it was, political governance. And how will these reforms happen? Well, I'll stop within a few seconds. No, I'll stop very quickly. Look, the reforms in the Security Council and in other structures of global governance, when they take place, there is no doubt that India will climb several notches. Why? Because we are the largest country in the world and we are going to become the third largest economy. It doesn't matter that we are 146th out of 183 in terms of per capita, it doesn't. The world is interested in your overall size. We will be part of that change. There should be no doubt. The question is when. My understanding is serious reform. The kinds of the G20 type of reform you can have even tomorrow. But if you really want serious reform which distinguishes, as they say, the boys from the men, then I am afraid the ones who are the haves today will have to see merit in having you inside rather than having you outside. My own feeling is that would happen earlier rather than later. Let me stop now.
So Manji, just one last question, really, and after that we'll close. I simply have run out of time. What about the G4 going to the General Assembly and getting a 2/3 majority? That's one way of telling the illustrious members of the UN Security Council who don't seem to agree on anything among themselves that, listen, that is one way out, or do you think it's a lousy idea?
No, one, it isn't. In 2005, 2006, we were very keen to do it. In fact, we, India, held back. And the reason is very simple. Supposing you don't get it, you're going to be pushed back for God knows how long. And why is that consensus not happening? It's not just because of China. Let's be very clear in the world. If the country that we think is behind us and holds our back, if they are with it, you'll get it. How did the nuclear suppliers group happen? Which was the country that moved heaven and earth? Who didn't? That's the nature of the game. And do people really want you in as yet? Look, in today's world, I think we need to understand that this will be a game between three big countries. You may say, USA and China, what's Russia? No. The Russians are a sui generis power in the world, which doesn't understand what you think is obvious, that they are weakened. They don't. They are powerful by themselves, and they have the abilities to be able to do that. Therefore, this kind of getting together is critically important. But it's a tough call, unlikely to happen tomorrow, day after. Remember, whenever it happens, we'll be in. And my understanding it will happen sooner rather than later, because both will find it beneficial for them in their hegemony to have you inside the table.
Thank you, Manju. I thought that was a very fitting intervention. Thank you. A very, very fitting intervention to this whole debate that we have had. I have no choice but to move on to the next session because we've got some top-notch people waiting as well, as top-notch as the panel here. So I would like to thank all of you for your patience. Please don't get up and go away because I'll just go down and get the next panel. Okay, thank you very much.